Greetings from my mom's kitchen in Virginia, and yes, I am wearing a sweater, and it's a little cool up here. The first thing that I wanted to talk about today is the issue of the Greek ships. So this video will be about the conundrum of the Greek ships, which, if you want to review the PowerPoint, remember we had the Pride of Sparta, which came into the dock but needed to be moved into the bigger dock. So plank by plank, they moved the ship, and we agreed that the Pride of Sparta ended up in Dock B. But then we had the Maid of Thebes that needed to be renovated, so the old rotten oak planks were replaced with brand new teak planks. So we agreed that the ship that had the brand new teak planks was still the Maid of Thebes. But then we had the issue with the Spirit of Athens. So the Spirit of Athens had oak planks, but they were perfectly fine oak planks. The captain wanted those really nice, pretty teak planks. And so the shipwright who's doing the replacing says, I don't want these oak planks to go to waste, so he reconstructs a boat in the next dock with the oak planks. And so now we have two ships, but which one is the real Spirit of Athens? So from our discussion in class, we brought up topics like, well, it depends on where the crew is. The crew would be on the real boat. Well, it would mean where the name appeared on the boat. Whichever one has the name, the Spirit of Athens, that must be it. Whoever holds the title to the boat, whichever boat has the title with it. So we had lots of ideas about which one would really be the Spirit of Athens. But these were our opinions. These were kind of expectations that we had. This isn't about what the captain thinks or about what the builder thinks. It's not about ownership, but it's really a question of identification. We want to know the truth about which ship is the real Spirit of Athens. The author in the text in the reading that you read for this week talked about how it cannot be that they're both the Spirit of Athens, because that's just not possible. And he also talks about how the answer can't be, well, neither one is. It has to be one or the other. Well, it might be ship X, and it might be ship Y. And there's something that can be said for each one of these options. It can't be neither, and it can't be both. So both of the solutions that are described there on page 16 are believable, and they make sense. Neither one is really wild or outrageous or off the wall. They're both equally believable. So we are at the limits of our common sense. Each solution is not an opinion, but has a reasoning behind it. And we were presented with those arguments in the text. So rather than looking at who has the title, where the crew lives, what we're going to be looking at is the reasons why each one of these boats could be the Spirit of Athens. So what we need to examine is, what are the taken for granted principles? What is each one taking for granted? So if you look at your reading on page 17, there's an argument for ship X. And the principle that is being taken for granted is that doing something to a ship over time isn't enough to change its identity. Replacing one plank at a time does not change the identity of the ship. If we look at the argument for the boat that's in Dock Y, the premise there is that the taken for granted principle is that a complex whole is nothing but the sum of its parts. We start with that premise. If those planks are arranged in exactly the same way, just in another place, then its identity has not changed. So now that we make these assumed principles explicit, these arguments can be neater. Now we can do some thinking about the arguments. We can reason about them. We're not going to talk about the two ships or the captains or the crew. Now we're going to talk about the arguments. It's not about ownership. It's not about where the crew resides or what the name says on the boat. This is about argument, reasons, and taken for granteds. So if we're trying to argue for one of these, It doesn't help just to restate your argument. It doesn't help to say the other one is wrong. By saying something is wrong is more just disagreeing, and you aren't really offering any criticism. You have to find out what is wrong with it. And you do this by looking inside the argument, not just at the conclusion. So if you look at the box on page 19 of your reading, there is rule number 1. And basically, this is the only rule. And what rule number 1 states is, any opinion for which someone can give reasons for that opinion is admissible in philosophy, but once a claim has been supported by an argument, then any additional criticism that comes after must engage the argument. So if we look at the argument that says ship X is the spirit of Athens, that replacing one plank does not alter the identity of the ship, that's the taken for granted. That's the premise. And if we say that ship Y is the spirit of Athens, the premise is a complex object is nothing more than the sum of its parts. Rule 1 tells us that we must engage the argument, and here are 2 different arguments. If we look at argument X, it's pretty easy to believe it makes sense. The only significant premise is that replacing one plank does not alter its identity. This argument would be really difficult to challenge, because if it did change the identity, then we would always wind up with a completely different vehicle every time we got one new part. And we would need new registration and title and tags and everything. But the content of the argument is not the only thing that we can challenge. We can challenge its form, its process. This argument's form is such that if we apply the principle from the beginning over and over again, that's how we come with the conclusion. We could argue that even though the argument in line 1 is valid, that applying it over and over and over again might not be valid. It's possible, if we think about it, from that true premise, we might come to a false conclusion. So one way we could do this is by modeling. And so if we want to challenge the form of this argument, we would use the same form, the same process, but different content. And if we use the same form, the same process, and started with a true premise but came to a false conclusion, if we could do this, then we can argue that the form of this argument is invalid. There's something wrong with it, and it's the form. So, if we use the process of modeling, we could say something like this. We have to apply the same process to it, the same form. So in keeping with our Greek theme, let's say we're going to talk about Homer. And at minute 0, Homer is bushy-headed, he has a full head of hair, and he is not bald. Step 2, where we set out our premise, is that plucking one hair from the head of a full-haired man does not transform him from being full-headed to being bald. That's our premise. But if we're going to use that form and repeat this over and over again, like the form in argument X, let's see how this plays out. So Homer at minute 2 is bushy-headed and not bald because we've just plucked one more hair. But if we repeat this pattern of reasoning over and over and over up to minute 10,000, each repetition reaching the immediate conclusion that Homer at that time is still bushy-headed and not bald, when we got to the end, our conclusion should be Homer at minute 10,000 is still bushy-headed and not bald. But we know if we repeat that process over and over again, that will not be the case. So we will have started from a true premise, removing one hair from Homer's head, doesn't make him bald, he's still bushy-headed. If we repeat that over and over again, we come to a false conclusion. And so we can say that the form, the process of this argument is invalid. Argument Y seems to be pretty believable as well. A complex whole is nothing but the sum of its parts. But we might think of some complex objects like cars or computers or machines that have replaceable parts. And what that means is the object continues through a change of some of its parts. This shows us that we would have to change the premise for it to be true, that we need to restrict the application of that principle to specific times. So we would need to change the premise to say, at any given time, a complex whole is nothing but the sum of its parts at that time in a determinate order. But once we've changed this premise so that it can be true, then we can see that another part of the reasoning is false. And if you look in the original argument in line 4, it's just not true that every plank that is a part of ship Y is a plank which is a part of the Spirit of Athens. Instead, what is true is that every plank which is a part of ship Y at minute 1000 is a plank which was a part of the Spirit of Athens. A plank is a part only at a particular time. Once it's been removed and replaced, it ceases to be part of the Spirit of Athens. We can say these planks were former parts of the Spirit of Athens. We can now say that what is wrong with this argument is that there's something wrong with its content. It has a false premise. So we started with arguments about two ships, and now we have two new arguments about arguments. The original question has not been answered, but now the focus has been shifted. Now we would need to look for something that might counter the notion about repeating something over time, or for something that would challenge the time restrictions that we decided has to be imposed on argument Y. This is doing philosophy.